Welcome to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
So Eugene, I'd like to turn now to the present moment in American free speech, American culture, and its impositions on free speech. And I want to start with this. There are some things in life you know when you feel them. You know when you're in love. You know when you're having fun. We have a pervasive feeling of being unfree in our culture today. Many of us feel like, I know one thing. I know that I'm not free to speak my mind. Where does that come from? Is it a matter of state action? Is it a matter of private action, therefore not controlled by the First Amendment? Is it somehow wrapped together? Can you, if it's mostly private action, is it time to question the state action requirement?
Right. So I think it's complicated. And it's complicated for a variety of reasons, one of which is we're never entirely free to speak our minds. Because a lot of the things we value, such as the respect of our friends or prospective business partners or whatever else, are going to be influenced by their reaction to our speech. So I remember I got an email from somebody who said, I want you to write on your blog about this topic. It's very important. I said, I'm sorry, I don't actually know anything about this. He says, no, the reason you're not writing about it is you are afraid that people will condemn you for what you write. I said, yes, I'm very much afraid that they will condemn me for what I write because I don't know anything about the subject. And what I write will probably be incorrect. And then they'll condemn me because I screwed up and was talking about something that I didn't know anything about. And they'd be right to condemn me for that. So was I chilled? Yes, I'm routinely chilled from writing about things by the desire to maintain my reputation as somebody who really knows what he's talking about. For example, there's sometimes even cases within my own field where I say, there's just too many facts that I'm going to have to learn about this case. I don't have enough time. And I could just opine based on my first reaction, but that would be a bad idea. And that's good chilling because then, if you go to my blog and you read what I say, it's probably because I really do know what I'm talking about. Likewise, people say, well, I'm afraid to speak up in class. Well, people have been afraid to speak up in class for a very long time. Some of it just because people are reluctant. It's hard to speak in front of a group. But also, they realize they're students. And because they're students, they don't know everything about the subject yet. They're still learning. And so maybe if they say something, they're going to say something that people will think is kind of foolish. And that will be socially bad for them. So there's always this constraint. Now, there is the sense that there is more than before a set of viewpoints that, first of all, are going to be condemned as evil or at least very bad and not just perhaps mistaken, as reflecting on your character, reflecting badly on your character, rather than just showing that you aren't really, maybe didn't do your readings well enough. Mm-hmm. The other sense that I think people have is that things are a lot more unforgiving than they were before. That before somebody could say, look, what you said in class is really kind of in bad taste. Or it's kind of offensive. And you say, well, all right, I'm sorry. Or you don't even say, I'm sorry. Well, okay, thanks for letting me know. I mean, that's how it came across. And it's good for me to know that, let's say. And then they just move on. But we see enough incidents, and how common it is, I don't know, but we've seen enough incidents where people's sense is you should now be blackballed for the rest of your career, or at least for years. What's more, we'll even find things that you said when you were 16, now you're 23, and we're going to try to damage your career because of that. So I think people are indeed more concerned about this. Part of the problem is this isn't something that the law can really respond to effectively because, of course, everybody has the right to criticize. That, too, is a part of a right to free speech. People have the right to shun someone. That's a right of maybe freedom of association. Interesting question whether what it said is constitutional, right? But certainly you can't have a rule that says you can't stop hanging out with someone because you don't like their views. You can't discriminate against people based on race, religion, politics in choosing whom to hang out with. Because after all, you have a right to choose, whether it's constitutional or not, to choose whom you hang out with and whom you respect. Likewise, people have the right to urge boycotts of someone. Or urge that this person not be hired for a particular job and the like. So it's not clear what the law can do. I do think people have a sense, which is probably correct, that there's a social norm has emerged that basically expressing not just a very narrow set, but quite a broad set of views that are seen as improper for various reasons, should be a basis, again, not just for disagreement, but for shunning. That I think is a dangerous social norm. My sense is, and not that I've lived through those times, but my sense is historically this had been not uncommon with regard to religious mores. Like if you say somewhere that you don't believe in God, or you say something that's seen as heretical, yes, you could be shunned by your community. You could, with all of that entails emotionally, economically, and such. And I think we thought that was a sign of closed-mindedness. That was, even for people who really took their religion very seriously, they should be more open to the possibility that they're mistaken, or more open to the possibility that somebody else is mistaken, but that the solution is to try to talk them around rather than to expel them from the community, or threaten them with expulsion from the community. So I do think there's some level of that. Now, this having been said, there are things that people will say that will lead me to basically kind of cut them off. It's a fairly narrow zone of things, and but it's true for all of us. There's some people I wouldn't invite to dinner, right? Mm-hmm. There are some people that if the law allows me not to hire them based on certain things, I might say, at the very least that somebody maybe expressed something in such a nasty way that I just don't have confidence in his ability to write really kind of good, persuasive briefs, which often have to operate on a very high level of politeness, let's say. So it's a matter of judgment calls, and it's something that's hard to have a categorical rule about, at least as to those things. It may be different as to students being expelled from school or something. So as a result, I think we can talk more broadly about the value of maintaining open-mindedness and trying to limit the number of things that we sort of think are, well, this is completely beyond the pale. If you draw the pale so narrowly that a lot of things are beyond the pale, you're cutting off a lot of really important debate. But those end up being difficult judgment calls.
And essentially what your view is that the lack of freedom is coming from a cultural development more than a legal development. The cultural development is to see a very wide variety of different views as taboo. There's always, every society has some taboos, but we have a lot of taboos. The taboos encompass things that a lot of people think and would like to talk about. And the taboos are being enforced with a particularly aggressive kind of ostracism. But you hasten to add that to shun people, to avoid them, to cut off your relationships with them is itself a protected right and has always happened. So these are changes in degree. But in saying that they're changes in degree, I'm reminded of a wonderful line from Hegel's Logic. And here I'll show my philosophical colors here. But Hegel has this great line where he says, if you pluck enough hairs off a man's head, eventually he's bald.
Right.
Changes in degree can become changes in kind. And you can transition by increasing the scope of taboos and the aggressiveness of their social enforcement by degrees to a genuinely unfree society. And I'll confess my own feeling. I don't feel free. I know when I'm in love, I know when I'm having fun, and I know I don't feel free. And I think I'm not alone in that.
So I was talking to somebody about this, and the question came up, well, what about Nazis? Should Nazis have free speech rights? I think they should, but if you're a Nazi, probably people will not want to do business.
Right.
Totally understood. The problem is it's never just about the Nazis, right? Thankfully, there actually are very few Nazis in America. It's a country of 330 million people. You can find some of everybody. Yeah. But as a fraction of the population, they're a very, very, very small group. I say that as a Jew. I worry about anti-Semitism in certain situations. I know there are anti-Semitic murderers, some of whom by kind of Nazi sympathizers, some of them by others. That's a very, very small part of American Jewish life, thankfully. But there are lots of people who people are willing to equate, if not quite with Nazis, but something along those lines, right? So that labels hate speech and such aren't just applied to Nazis. They're applied to people who, for example, express what is seen as transphobic views, such as that transgender athletes should not participate on women's sports teams. Or to take another example, a case in which was just decided by the Ninth Circuit, where actually I filed an amicus brief in support of the beauty pageant, a beauty pageant's view that they're limited only to natural-born women, which is to say non-transgender contestants. These are important things to debate. And the very fact that there are actually a lot of people who take those views, so for example, that transgender athletes should not participate in women's sports teams. Polls often show majority, in fact, overwhelming majority support, or at least very substantial majority support for that position. Maybe it's a wrong position, but you need to be able to talk about it, because otherwise, how can you persuade the other side if they're not willing to articulate it? To you. They're probably going to be willing to articulate it at the ballot box when they can do it confidentially by voting for candidates that support their view. How can you persuade them? How can you learn their best arguments so that you can respond to them in turn? That a society in which these kinds of mainstream things people are reluctant to debate in the standard places where debate is the norm, like the law school classroom, let's say, like social media platforms and the like, that's a society that is much less likely to be able to reach compromise on these issues, much less likely to find kind of more enlightenment on those issues. I'll give you I think the transgender athletes in women's sports, I think it's a very serious question, right? Men and women are physically different. That's why we have women's sports. Is there such a thing as the women's basketball, the National Basketball Association? Because if women had to play against men, they would lose all the time at that level, not at lower levels. I mean, there are lots of women who are much faster than I am. But if you look at competitors in track and field at the very top levels, it's all men, because there's a difference. We're mammals, and many mammals have differences between males and females, as do non-mammals too. But so there are these differences, and the question is, what do you do with that? And one possible answer is, if somebody identifies as female, if they have perhaps something in their brain that makes them think that they are female, that's what should lead us to label them female, notwithstanding that they have a body that looks like a men's body and in fact looks like a very high-level competitive athlete's body. Or you might think, well, we should be able to have transgender athletes be able to participate in women's sports, but it shouldn't be enough that they just sort of say they identify. Maybe they have to be on testosterone blockers for some time, so they have to have a more female hormonal system, essentially, or something along those lines. In a lot of these questions, the issue is one of compromise, one of what is the right position. Well, you can't compromise if the one side realizes it's not able to just even articulate its views on from one or another perspective without being ostracized, without being ejected from various institutions.
I love that you ended there, because that's exactly where I want to go. You said without being ostracized or without being ejected from various social institutions. Right. I think there are some important differences there, and I want to explore them with you. One can divide the sort of sanction regime for saying politically unorthodox things today into two categories, I think. We're setting aside state action, because none of this seems to be state action. Very little of it, if any, is coming directly from sort of police coming to your house or other kinds of direct state actors.
Well, very little of it comes from the government as sovereign. A good deal comes from the government as educator, let's say.
Well, yes, we could talk about universities in a second, and I want to go there. But just initially, it seems like there is a kind of sanction that is purely private. That is to say, it's a whole lot of people saying that you, for expressing a heterodox view, are a bad person, you're a condemnatory person, and you deserve to be shunned, and then engaging in shunning. This is the kind of thing you might see on Twitter with a sort of Twitter cancellation. And it's the kind of thing you might see in the social milieu of a university or a workplace where just no one wants to work with you anymore because you've said so. That is a problem if you think that the thing being said is not beyond the pale. But it's a different kind of problem than the other kind, which is some sort of institutional consequence, like you work for a company, private or not, and you get fired.
Right.
Or you get investigated by a university office of equity or something of that nature. These are a variety of institutional consequences that follow on from these taboo actions. Or indeed, you get deplatformed by Twitter, which is an institutional actor, albeit not a state actor.
Right.
How does the law make any distinction between this sort of purely private condemnation and shunning on the one hand and institutional consequences on the other?
I can answer unequivocally, yes and no. So some laws do and some laws don't. So for example, as I mentioned, in many states, it is illegal. In some states, it's criminal for an employer to fire you for your political views that you've expressed, and some require some nexus to an election campaign. Some just say any kind of ideological views, on political topics. In those, some of them apply perhaps to on-the-job speech as well as off-the-job. Some apply just off the job speech. And in theory, at least, in practice, it's not clear how well enforced those laws are, although many laws are not very well enforced. In those states, you would be able to sue your employer for firing this way. So just to take the example of the transgender athletes question, if an employer fires an employee in California because the employee just on their own Twitter account tweeted out saying, I don't think these athletes are really women and they don't belong in women's sports, that would be a violation of California labor law. And again, in a few places, it would be actually a crime, although then you need to have a prosecutor who's willing to enforce that. What about private universities? Well, in one state, California again, it's actually illegal for a private university or even a private high school, setting aside religious universities and high schools, to institute a speech code that imposes disciplinary sanctions on students based on speech that would be protected off campus.
May I interrupt? Often your examples of the most free speech protective state is California. California that has these laws that apply quite comprehensively to employers and universities, even if private, and kind of, as it were, extend our First Amendment rights to those contexts. And yet, California is sort of famous for being one of the cultures in which you will suffer the worst consequences for saying unorthodox things. You get fired from Google, fired for truth, as it was. You get canceled at Berkeley. Maybe you get shunned at UCLA. I mean, it just seems like this law is highly ineffective if it exists.
And that's true of many laws. Many laws are not tremendously well enforced for a variety of reasons. One thing is actually a lot of employees, if they're fired by their employer, they may figure, look, I can sue, but even if I win, I lose. First of all, my name is out there now as a litigious employee who sues her ex-employer, which many future employers might not much care for. And on top of that, the employer, this reminds people of my speech that the employer fired me for, and maybe a lot of future employers won't want me to hire me based on that. So maybe it's better for me just to find some other employer and not sue. Plus also, maybe some lawyers aren't as knowledgeable about these employment laws as they are about, say, Title VII and other such things. So yeah, we should never overestimate the effectiveness of a law at actually constraining human behavior, as the crime rate shows, right? Well, it's against the law to rob people, and yet somehow people do that, even though the punishments potentially are quite substantial.
But this is different because what we're seeing in California is institutional actors that have legal standing. They are not understood as criminals. They have relationships with the government and relationships with they're locked in a network of significant legal relationships. If you're right, they are quite routinely violating California law and getting away with it.
Right. So I don't know how often this is so. I mean, we hear this in the news, but there are a lot of
selection
in California. But the answer is, I think, probably that's right. And probably they are mostly getting away with it because it's hard to litigate these cases. And again, a lot of employees are reluctant to sue. And maybe some employers don't even know about these rules. Again, they're not as famous as the Civil Rights Act. I wrote a law review article trying to chronicle or trying to identify all of them. It was about 10 years ago. And I found there were some in some states that nobody had ever really written about. The California one had drawn a little bit more attention. So you mentioned the employer. You mentioned the schools. So employers, California is about the half the states that have some kinds of protection against retaliation by private employers. It's the only state that has a law that limits speech codes imposed by private universities and private high schools. Maybe there should be such laws in other states. Maybe there should be a federal law, or at least focused on institutions that get federal funds. So you could argue about whether it may make sense to have more such laws. Maybe if it's done at the federal level, let's say, or with the right kind of remedial scheme, it's going to draw more attention.
So I'd like to ask you about that, the maybe. It seems like the present moment of sort of cancel culture, woke cancel culture, is not easily addressed by the First Amendment.
Right.
Because of the state action requirement.
Right.
And there's a layer of activity that involves purely private individuals condemning one another morally and shunning one another or ostracizing one another, which really seems beyond the reach of the law and should be beyond the reach of the law. But there's a middle tier of institutional action that is perhaps because state laws don't exist in some places or are not enforced effectively in other places, which is happening quite regularly and getting away with it.
And by the way, what we don't know is how many employers get a demand that they fire somebody for their speech. They run it by legal, and legal says, we're in California. There's this labor code 1101, 1102. Maybe you should just ignore that. And they say, okay, fine. And then it doesn't make the news.
Known unknowns in the Donald Rumsfeld trial.
Right. So the deterrent force of the law is not easily measured by the number of times the law is violated. Rather, the question is how often the law is complied with. And we don't know. That's the thing, because that doesn't make the news.
So let me ask you my follow-up question. What would you think of a federal statute extending First Amendment rights to private institutional actors? Assume that we can come up with a reasonable definition of institution, maybe borrowing from the Civil Rights Act.
Oh, no. Well, no, I would need to know more, whether you just mean employers, whether you mean educators, whether you mean platforms, whether you mean newspapers, because I think the answer may be very different for all of them.
Well, then let's start with employers.
Right. So for employers, I have an article coming out, I hope in a couple of months, dealing with that same question. So 10 years ago, I wrote an article about what the actual laws are out there. And finally, I'm following up with a normative article about what the law ought to be. And I don't have a clear answer. First of all, I should say I'm not a big fan of extra restrictions on employers. I think that while obviously you could certainly see the argument for protecting employees from retaliation by employers, you could certainly also see the argument for giving employers more flexibility rather than less in dismissing employees. And one constant danger, of course, is you have an employee who's not doing a good job, and you fire them, or you threaten to fire them, and they say, oh, no, I think the real reason you're firing me is because of what I posted on my Facebook page. And you say, no, that's not the reason. Well, that's what you're saying, says the disgruntled employee. I think it's just a pretext. I think the real reason is you don't like my politics. The employer may be in a position where they have a very hard time firing an employee who does need to be fired. On top of that also, the fact is employers hire people because they think that they're going to make more from the person's work than what they're going to pay them, right? And of course, that's why people take a job, because they think they're going to make more from their salary than the loss of enjoyment of life that comes from having to go to work every day. So now here's an employee. Let's say they make $100,000 worth of revenue for the company. They get paid $80,000. That sounds like a net win for the company. But now they say something that causes so much public hostility that that's a loss of $50,000 for the employer. So now the employer is paying the $80,000 in the salary, but is only getting a net of $50,000 from the employer because they are getting $100,000 worth of production minus $50,000 of lost goodwill. Or what if the loss of goodwill is $1 million worth of that? Now they're having to pay this person money, even though they're losing money hand over fist from having them there. And you might say, well, it's not fair that the public is trying to get this person fired and is boycotting the employer until the person is fired or what have you. But maybe not fair to the employer to have to keep on the job this employee who's now a net loss. And that's especially so if it's not just public reaction, but coworker reaction, right? We know that morale and people's willingness to kind of work well with each other are important. So you might say if somebody is saying things that really alienate coworkers, they just very difficult for them to be an efficient worker. This having been said, if you think that the purpose of free speech is, let's say, to promote democratic self-government and governmental restraints on it interfere with democratic self-government or the search for truth or self-expression, all of that is just as much implicated in many ways by the threat of loss of livelihood. Now, maybe if we're talking about if you ask somebody, would you rather lose your job or go to prison for 5 years? They'd say, I'd rather lose my job. Yeah, but if you ask them, would you rather lose your job or be fined $500? They'd say, I'd rather take the fine.
Sure.
So if we say you can't fine people $500 or however much for their speech because that would interfere with democratic self-government, search for truth, self-expression, then it may very well be that private employer retaliation will have much the same effect.
It seems to me that some of your arguments about private employers' freedom and even fairness to private employers, it's easy to imagine a world in which that would totally undo meaningful freedom of speech. I say meaningful freedom of speech. I mean, just imagine that you had a sort of employer class, or if you work at, you're a lawyer, you work at law firms, you're a doctor, you work at hospitals and medical firms and the like. And you could imagine you could imagine something really very, very restrictive. So if you express a pro-life view, or even just a Republican view. You're a Republican instead of a Democrat. You are fired. You are unemployable. You are essentially blacklisted from your profession. That's the death of free speech. And at that point, it's really quite distracting to talk about employers' rights. I mean, if we're committed to a community based on free speech, we can't just hold the state action requirement as sacrosanct. We have to hold personal liberty as sacrosanct.
Well, but I think sacrosanct is a little too strong a word for all these things. The fact is that personal liberty, as we acknowledge, has to be constrained, or I shouldn't say has to be constrained. That my personal liberty to speak doesn't mean that I can force you to like me. It doesn't mean I can force you to hang out with me. Should it mean that I can force you to do business with me? Maybe, but that is a considerable infringement, or I shouldn't say infringement, has a considerable effect on your liberty. That the employers might have some claim to a liberty not to associate with people who either they dislike or not that pay money to someone who is, again, a net loss for them. Now, it may be that on balance, the importance of democratic self-government is so great that that overcomes that. Or it might be that if you forbid the employers from firing people based on their politics, then the employer can mitigate some of the harms, at least of the boycotts, by saying, look, to the would-be boycotters, don't take it out on us. We appreciate your argument that we should fire this guy, but we can't. So presumably some of the boycotters will say, okay, fine, why should we keep boycotting you if you're only following the law? That, by the way, was a common argument in favor of civil rights laws, right? A lot of employers used to say, with some credibility, look, if we hire black employees, then a lot of our white customers just wouldn't be willing to come. And the answer was, well, if the law requires you to hire black employees, and if all the employers have black employees, then maybe the white customers would change their views. So maybe something similar with regard to politics is if everybody is barred from firing people based on their politics, then there'll be a lot fewer calls for employers to fire people when it's well known that that's now illegal. But this having been said, again, I sympathize with employers' desire to make sure that they're not paying money to people who are actually doing more to damage the business than to help the business.
Seems like this goes to a fundamental question in libertarian political philosophy. So libertarians are traditionally freedom-loving. They are trying to optimize or maximize individual liberty, including the liberty to speak one's mind. But they are also historically very focused on state power.
Right.
And what the present age involves, what the present cancel culture phenomenon involves, is profound limitations on liberty based on non-state power or substantially non-state power. Private universities, creating something akin to formal sanctions and informal ostracism for having unorthodox views. Private corporations doing the same. My law students who are conservative, leaning, or religious are terrified of being outed to their law firms because they feel they'll be fired from the law firms, potentially blacklisted from the profession. And as you say, it's much worse than just getting fined by the government. It's a much worse consequence. We seem to be in a position where we are choosing between our commitment to liberty and our commitment to limiting state power.
Right.
Because increasing liberty means getting the state involved in limiting private actors. How do you think about that dilemma? I guess the real question is, some libertarians I know are rethinking their premises. They're rethinking what it means to truly be committed to liberty in a world where so much of the restrictions on liberty are coming from the people who run institutions. Where are you on that question?
Well, I don't know where I am. I'm not a libertarian. I think there's a lot of truth to libertarianism. I think there's truth to some liberal strands of thought, some conservative strands of thought. I don't want to feel like I have taken the loyalty oath to some belief system, and now I can't change my views or I can't come up with my own sense of the views. So I will say that this issue is an old issue. John Stuart Mill in On Liberty was speaking not just about constraints imposed on government, but constraints imposed by society. And that was bad for society. I don't think he was calling for more employment laws, but that was bad for society to use social pressure to constrain dissenters in various ways. What's more, historically, I think this has been quite common. Again, I think particularly common with regard to religion.
Right.
If you shifted to unorthodox views on religion, then you could be expelled, even not very religious places, like situations not like people are super duper devout, but the thought was if you're an atheist or an agnostic or a free thinker, that means that you're kind of a bad person and we shouldn't trust you. Likewise, you're talking about the blacklist. This is what happened in various industries, but especially famously in Hollywood in the 1950s with regard to communists. And of course, just as it's never about the Nazis, it's never just about the communists. It's about people who are seen as sympathizers or whatever else. And a lot of them found it very hard to keep jobs and get new jobs. And during time of wartime fervor, historically, there have often been strong social sanctions against people who speak out against the war. So I don't think it's terribly new. I do think it's a very serious problem. And I do think it's a reminder that indeed
Excuse me.
It's okay. I do think it's a reminder that indeed our liberty is threatened by a lot of things. Just to give you an example, I think libertarians may say sometimes, what we're really worried about is threats to liberty from the government. And then you say, but wait a minute. What about from a foreign government? Like, what if the Russians wanted to invade us and restrict our liberty even more? I think they might say that is a government, but they might say, well, what we're thinking about is threats of force, and our government uses coercive force, and the Russians could too. And likewise, what about crime? Like, don't you think we should have no policing? Whatever. They say, no. We're really worried about criminals too, because criminals interfere with our liberty too, but it's again through force. And their response with regard to an employment relationship is a voluntary relationship, and there's no real force there.
May I interrupt there?
Yeah.
That strikes me as dogmatic.
It is. That's why I said libertarians may say this, because that is libertarian dogma. But I'm sorry, you were saying.
Well, it strikes me as dogmatic because it just fails to recognize that professional consequences, like being blacklisted, like being fired from your job or blacklisted from your profession, are so significant that you can in fact create a deeply unfree society.
Right.
A society with almost a Soviet level of repression without getting the state directly involved if all these private actors coordinate in their sanctions. And I want to mention something even about the purely private kind of shunning and ostracism. While it may be that is beyond the reach of the law, and I'll even stipulate that for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's important even then to recognize how significant that kind of social ostracism and shunning is if you're really interested in liberty. I think about my oldest daughter, to bring her up for a second time in our conversation. She's 12, so unsurprisingly, she is intensely motivated by peer popularity.
If I could just interrupt for a moment, I think what you mean to say is she's human.
She's
so
human.
Unsurprisingly, she's intensely motivated by peer popularity. That is human nature. We are a social animal, and that is very much our nature to, in any environment to fit in.
If she is in a social environment, or if she is in a series of social environments such that she cannot find her way out of them, and in those social environments, a variety of things she may otherwise think are unsayable because they will cause her to lose all her friends and all her social standing, her esteem, the thing we all crave so much, if we're being honest, which is the esteem of our peers. She simply won't think those things, or she would keep it very quiet if she does, though I think actually human psychology is flexible enough that it would actually bleed into freedom of thought itself, and she would cease to think those things. That's true of many, many people. And so if we're taking freedom seriously, we have to take seriously the threat of creating monolithic cultures in our elite institutions.
Right. I think that is a danger. And by the way, that is a traditional insight of the left in America. So actually, the very first anti-discrimination law, employment discrimination laws that I could find in the U.S. actually came before the Civil War. And they were basically bans on firing of employees because of how they voted. This is before the secret ballot. So employers would often know this. And the sense was allowing employers to fire employees based on how they voted would basically allow them to leverage their economic power into political power, because then employees would know they have to vote the way the employer likes. Then this was adapted to ban discrimination based on political expression, at least in certain situations, right after the Civil War. Interestingly enough, by statute. The first such rules were done by military governor orders. They were in Reconstruction era South, I believe in Louisiana and South Carolina, are the ones that still remain essentially now as state statutes. And the concern was that the Democratic planters, that just happened to be white Southerners were generally Democrats, would threaten their employees, both whites and the freedmen, with being fired for supporting Republican candidates. And then, of course, came the next wave of prohibition and discrimination, which was based on union membership. An employer said, look, we should be free to hire or not hire whomever we want. And if we don't want to hire union members, we should be free to do that. And, it's just the employment relationship is a matter of voluntary interaction. And labor laws were enacted that rested on the notion, again, the generally left-wing notion, that no, it's not just a matter of voluntary interaction. Because so much is at stake for the employee in these kinds of situations, we need to protect the employee not just against force, not just against their property being stolen, but also against threats to their livelihood if they engage in activity, which is whether voting or expression or union membership, that we think they ought to be able to engage in. So that's been very much a view historically of the left. Maybe the libertarians and conservatives should learn a little bit about that. This having been said, one common libertarian response to which I think has a lot of force is, well, all right, you've identified a possible problem. Now show us that the cure is better than the disease. That if the solution to the problem is give the government yet more power to constrain employers, then the result will be that it becomes even harder to have competitive businesses, to have the free market in labor really operating, because, for example, employees might either with impunity say things that do indeed jeopardize working relations in ways that are kind of unavoidable and that employers should be able to forbid, at least on the job, and maybe even as to off the job speech, or employees will just claim, oh, we were fired because of our speech, and then employers will realize it's too risky to fire the employees. So I think there are real economic constraints and liberty constraints in employment law, and adding to them might be worthwhile, but maybe on balance will do more harm than good. Very hard to tell, I think.
So imagine we have a listener or viewer who is convinced that the problem is of emergency proportions, the problem of professional blackballing or social ostracism, and he thinks it will not fix itself, and he thinks there needs to be some sort of legal response. What would you tell that person? What would you think the best available legal response to the present moment is?
I'd say if you want to do this, then you could certainly point out that this has been the law for some states over a century. Of course, it hasn't been much enforced. You might want to think a little bit about how the law should be crafted. So, for example, you might want to make sure that the law provides for successful plaintiffs to recover attorney fees, like they can under Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is a very important reason why there is a lot of employment discrimination litigation.
So the relevant laws are discrimination on the basis of viewpoint laws.
They're basically discrimination based on your political activity, which is often read broadly enough to cover political speech. So you might say, look, have a look at them. Although there may be some others. Maybe you'd say you can't discriminate based on any speech at all. Or maybe you'll say, look, the employer ought to have flexibility about what's said on the job, even down to viewpoint-based restrictions, because, on the job, there's too much of a risk of coworkers getting really upset and lots of interference with the morale, and just something that could really be devastating to the business ability to function normally. But off the job, people should be free to say whatever they want. And if a coworker doesn't like it, then the employer's job is to tell the coworker, look, you gotta deal with it because of free speech interests.
You could also have some sort of norm in terms of on-the-job speech, that is considered so disruptive that it has to interfere with the organizations that you could do that. Sanction it. You could have such a law that says, well, it has to be equal on both sides. If you can't say, if you can't express a pro-life position, you also can't express a pro-choice position.
Right.
If you can't.
You could imagine that. It gets really complicated. But in any case, there are all of these models out there.
So there are existing models. And what you'd have to do is find one that's relatively successful, make it effectively enforced, and then let it rip, maybe federally.
Right. So imagine this hypothetical viewer and listener also has some money to donate to some political campaign along these lines or something like that, or start a new campaign. You might say, okay, sit down with all of these statutes, figure out which ones seem to be relatively clear. They were written in different states, very different eras, some dating back over a century, some just the Utah one from the last 10 years. Try to get a sense of whether they are enforced in that jurisdiction and how they work, and then maybe propose this as a federal statute. maybe either like a new protected classification in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, or something that maybe you might start with, say, federal government contractors or whatever else. So there certainly are lots of models. It's not like it's some unthinkable thing that's alien to American law that can't be done. It has been done in lots of states in lots of ways. So it may be worth experimenting with. This having been said, I do think libertarians have a plausible argument that there are very few problems that further regulations can't make worse.
And on that note, I'd like to end by addressing something I think many listeners will have been thinking of from the beginning, which is the role of social media companies. A lot of the cancellation issues in today's world are connected to social media platforms. It's well known, for example, that Twitter killed the Hunter Biden laptop story. They were worried about the story about Hunter Biden's laptop being fodder for Trump's reelection. And so they arranged that if you tried to forward the New York Post story, broke the news about Hunter Biden's laptop, your tweet would fail. It just wouldn't send. YouTube is famous for putting various kinds of speech behind, that is political speech, like critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement, either just forbidding it, taking it off, deplatforming it, or putting it behind age restrictions. Amazon has refused to shelve certain books. I guess they're not technically a social media company, but a big tech company. Less well known is that a variety of book publishers have refused to publish rebuttals to the 1619 Project. So the New York Times has its race-oriented 1619 Project, and a variety of historians have written rebuttals that can't get published because publishers won't publish them. So I would like to hear, just in closing, your views about the role of social media in restricting speech, engaging in cancellations and deplatforming, and whether you think there's a range of remedies that are desirable or possible in this realm. Well, perhaps you're more skeptical of those remedies in ordinary private businesses. You know, if a law firm wants to fire someone for his or her political views, so be it, you think, maybe. But it's different when Twitter wants to deplatform or engage in viewpoint discrimination because of Twitter's distinctive role in the marketplace of ideas or something of that ilk. So let me give you a chance to respond.
Well, so I wrote an 80-page article on the subject. So
why am I not surprised?
Right. So it's hard to boil it down, but let me try to boil it down to two things. So one is, let's think back, all the way back to 2010, 12 years. Citizens United causes this firestorm. It was a 5-4 decision, 4 liberals very sharply criticizing the majority. And then I think very many newspapers and commentators and such, mostly from the left, but the center left, not the far left by any means, sharply criticized Citizens United. What Citizens United held was that corporations cannot be forbidden from advocating for or against political candidates, that they have a First Amendment right to speak. Well, what did the dissent say? Well, basically, I oversimplify, but basically, you can't allow corporations to leverage their economic power into political power this way. And I think that's a very serious concern. Now, I'm actually with the majority in Citizens United, because I think even though it's a serious concern about leveraging economic power into political power, I think corporations, which are ultimately organizations of people, should have the right to express their views. But the question is, what if they're not just expressing their views? What if they're blocking people from expressing their views, albeit on the corporation's property? Is that something that we should restrain this selective blocking?
May I? You're making a distinction between YouTube putting out a video on its platform, which is the voice of YouTube. You know, we here, who are YouTube, we are the corporation, think that the following propositions about trans athletes or pro-choice or whatever else are true. And they put that out there. But the question that you're raising is there's a distinction between that and deplatforming or otherwise restricting people on the other side who use the YouTube platform.
And one way it might play out is Twitter sometimes posts little kind of rebuttals or fact checks, supposed fact checks of such certain tweets. That is the corporation's speech. But blocking this somebody's post, I think that's not really the corporation's speech. It's not even corporation's refusal to speak. It's its refusal to allow certain things on its property. And I appreciate that as a matter of property rights, but maybe that's a property right that ought to be restricted in some measure. And here's my second thought. You might think about a spectrum. On one side are newspapers and magazines. They are platforms in that they publish other people's stuff. A magazine will often publish things by a lot of different writers, but you can't require them to be content neutral or even viewpoint neutral. If you tell the New Republic or National Review to be viewpoint neutral, they'll stop being the New Republic and National Review, right? And so those entities have been found to have First Amendment rights to select what's going to be published there. And it's important that they have these rights because that solves the problem of information overload. People want to read a newspaper in part precisely because, sometimes because of its ideology, but at least because they don't want to see fake news. And we certainly want newspapers to block things that they view as fake news. Bookstores is an interesting question, and maybe you might distinguish bricks and mortar bookstores from online bookstores, which don't have capacity limits. But historically, we've again had socialist bookstores, free market bookstores, feminist bookstores, Christian bookstores, so maybe they have these rights as well. And then on the other extreme, you have things like phone companies. A phone company can't say, well, we just don't like the KKK, or we don't like the communists. I mean, the communists are trying to undermine private property, which is how we make a living. So we're not going to listen into anybody's conversation. But when we know that something is a recruiting line or get out the vote line or an information line that's being promoted as for the KKK or for the communists, we're just going to say, not on our phone lines. Well, they're not allowed to do that. They're so-called common carriers. They have to carry everybody. That's true whether they're government-provided monopolies, such as traditional landlines, although even those aren't quite monopolies given competition from cable. And it's also true even if they're famously competitive cell phone companies. Likewise, UPS and FedEx are common carriers. They're not allowed to say we refuse to deliver books from a socialist bookstore. Another thing that's kind of like them, but only in the laws of a few states, again, including California, but not limited to California, is large shopping malls are viewed as places where people have the right to go and speak under California state law rules. And the Supreme Court said that doesn't violate the shopping mall's First Amendment rights. The shopping mall can't be required to say things, but it can be required to host things. It can be required by state law to basically allow leafleters and signature gatherers on its property, even if it would rather not. Another example is the Congress passed a law that required universities, as a condition of getting federal funds, to allow military recruiters. Back at a time when the military was discriminating based on sexual orientation, and some universities, and especially law schools, were refusing to allow military recruiters on those grounds. The Supreme Court said, we don't even care about the funding hook. This law is constitutional because Congress could have enacted this law just as a categorical rule on everybody because, you may be required as a university to host speakers that you disagree with, not inside your speaker programs, not in the classes you organize. Those are coherent speech products that, of course, the government can't interfere with any more than it can interfere with a newspaper. But if you open up recruiting for a wide range of recruiters, you could be required to include military recruiters.
So may I summarize?
Yes.
Your basic view with respect to these social media platforms and a variety of other things that might be characterized as platforms, including, for example, universities or an online bookstore or something like that, is that they're free to speak, but they are not necessarily free to prevent others from using their platform to speak to the contrary. It depends on whether they get classified as a common carrier. And we can take our existing common carrier law that already applies to things like phone companies. They can't say no phone calls from Republicans or no phone calls from conservatives or something like that. We already have that with respect to mail carriers. You just extend that existing system of law to a variety of corporations that are presently platforms.
So let me be a little bit more cautious. I do think they have the right to speak, for example, in deciding whether to put up fact checks and also deciding what to recommend, like what to promote in their own algorithms. They could say, when we're recommending things, we only want to recommend things that we think are worth recommending. But I think it might be permissible to treat the hosting function of the platforms and the ability to forward their posts for users to individually forward their posts to their friends and followers might be plausible to view that more as the shopping mall or the university with regard to recruiters or the phone company. I'm not sure that's right. I mean, I think the law here is complicated and the policy arguments are complicated too. But I think that's at least a plausible position, given that we have the spectrum of private entities, some of which indubitably have First Amendment rights. And in any event, certainly nobody should want to interfere with that, have the rights to decide what to publish and what not in their pages. And then you have other things that don't have the right to decide what to host and what not to host on their property. And the question is where these various functions of the social media networks fall on that spectrum.
So Eugene, I just have one last question. A lot of these complex, difficult legal questions we've been discussing for the last however many minutes have been, they arise because of a deep cultural change. A deep cultural change where free speech just isn't honored the way it once was in our society. And this is not a legal question. This is really a question of what it is we value as a community and as a culture. Free speech is often seen as cover for racism, sexism. Free speech is often seen as hurtful. Sometimes speech is equated with violence. And a lot of these arguments have become very, very popular in contemporary America and weren't that popular in some earlier eras of American history. I think about my own youth and early adulthood. And there's been a distinct cultural shift. And I wonder if, setting aside the law for the moment and speaking more broadly about free speech values, if you could talk about that cultural shift and how you think we might somehow reset to a more speech valuing culture.
So I'm skeptical about claims of cultural shifts, in part because to really be able to say with confidence, you need to have both a really good metric of the current cultural state. And we all see only small portions of the culture. And we all overweight the ones that we run across. And then you have to have a sense for how it was before. And of course, our memories of that are even weaker than our perceptions of the current situation. So for example, I mean, maybe there was a little golden era in the 80s and 90s when there was a lot of toleration of views, even the ones that were seen as extreme on the left and on the right and such. But certainly, again, we have the experience of the Hollywood blacklist, the blacklisting of communists and others who are sort of seen as communist fellow travelers in the 1950s. We certainly had seen situations where dissenting views with regard to religion were quite dangerous for people to express. Unpatriotic views. During the Iraq War, there were attempts to what today would be called cancel some entertainers and such for their what was seen as unpatriotic positions. They were, I think, somewhat less than what we're seeing now. And I do think it's a little bit different when you're talking about entertainers and like spokespeople whose job is to kind of is based on public enthusiasm for them. And if somebody loses the affection of the public, at that point, they will start losing business. But in any event, I think this is part and parcel of broader reality that a variety of speech has historically been something that's dangerous to say, including dangerous to say with regard to your employment. Although often it's been maybe for the employers, it hasn't been your ideology, but your criticism of the company. Could be very political criticism, but the company says we don't want to hire you anymore.
This is a cogent argument, but it feels excessively abstract. Sure. Do you really think there hasn't been a visible shift in how American culture operates and how it relates to speech?
So I think there's been shift in attitudes towards certain kinds of things. It may have been more of a shift among, for example, lawyers that we know, or lawyers, which is to say the field that we know best. I'm not sure how much a typical factory worker, let's say in 1970 or 80, might feel with regard to his speech possibly leading to employment to employer retaliation, either in the form of firing or other kinds of things the employer can do, like sort of say, you're never going to get another raise here again or something like that, as opposed to today. It's an interesting question, and maybe there's a difference. I will say about social media, speech today, as a practical matter, for people is vastly freer than it was in 1990, precisely because we have the internet and the social media. In 1990, it wasn't a question, well, you could distribute anything you want. Even if you have no money, you can express your views, but then there's some segment of the views that might get you banned from some social media platforms. You just couldn't express your views at all. Maybe you might stand on the street corner and nobody's listening to you. Maybe you could print up some leaflets which costs money and then hand them out and nobody would read them. But today, you have vastly more practical free speech than before. Maybe part of the problem, though, is that we tasted, there was something where I think there was much broader speech rights, basically around 2010 to 2015 maybe, when people were able to speak online through social media and the like. There were a lot fewer restrictions on that. And people came to think of that as their entitlement, which it may be. Maybe it should be their entitlement. But I do think it's important to realize that for most people, their ability to speak public is just vastly greater than it had ever been in human history, in American history, and in our lifetimes up until around 2000. And starting with 2000 with, say, blogging, and then starting with about 2010 with social media, that's when people were really able to start speaking. And that was perhaps the golden age, as it were, at least for the ability to speak. And maybe we want to recover that, but it's important to realize that we're now at a level still far superior when it comes to practical free speech on social media platforms than we were in 1990, when people just weren't able to speak unless they were professors or they were newspaper columnists.
Well, I think on that relatively optimistic, I hasten to say relatively, on that relatively optimistic note, perhaps we should end. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very much my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today. To learn more, visit freedomofthought.fedsoc.org.